My guest today is Dr. Tom Wadsworth, whose recent YouTube videos about why the early church didn't have worship services have attracted more than 750,000 views from more than 110 countries around the world. His videos stem from over 40 years of study and his doctrinal research into Christian assemblies in the first century. He's a professional speaker, writer, and biblical scholar who has 2 master's degrees and a PhD, all in New Testament. Welcome, Dr. Wadsworth.
Well, thank you, Adam. It's good to be with you.
Could you start off by giving me your testimony and then eventually into your epiphany, I suppose, in 1977 that kicked all of this off?
Yeah, one testimony and one epiphany coming up here. I assume by testimony you'd like to know how I became a Christian. So that sound right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, well, I was born and raised Lutheran here in this small town in northern Illinois, Dixon, Illinois. But when I turned 18, I started dating a girl who was going to a church that was much more Bible oriented. And I started studying the Bible with them and made a decision at age 18 to become a Christian, at which time I was immersed in water and baptized into Christ and following biblical directions on that thing. And I found my life dramatically changed. All of a sudden, I felt like I was on the inside of the church looking out instead of on the outside looking in, if you know what I mean. My entire perspective just changed on everything. And I was a freshman in college at the time. And within a few months, I actually made the decision to pursue ministry instead of accounting as my college major. Then transferred to another college. I went to Harding in Arkansas, where I finished a bachelor's degree in biblical studies with a minor in New Testament Greek. Went on to their graduate school in Memphis, Tennessee for 3 years and finished there with an MTh, which is the equivalent now. They now call it an MDiv there. Was in ministry for about 10 years. And then got out of the ministry in 1985, some time ago. Then was in the corporate world for about 30 some years. But one thing that started nagging me, or back in 1977, my first year of full-time preaching, as we would have called it, I was preaching through 1 Corinthians and came on chapter 14. And the chapter was all about the Christian assembly, what Christians do when they get together. It's, a matter of fact, the longest chapter in the Bible that discusses that specific topic. And Paul therein talks about what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do in the assembly. And he points to the purpose of everything that is done in the assembly, which is edification. It's a Greek word oikodome, which means to build up one another. Whatever you do in the assembly, he says, let all things be done for edification, for the building up of other people in the assembly. Now, this blew my mind, Adam, because the church I was in and every church I'd ever known believed that everything you do when you get together is for the worship of God. After all, we all have houses of worship. We go to worship on Saturday or Sunday, whatever it is with your particular tradition. We have an order of worship. We open worship with this. We close worship with that. Worship terminology just is throughout our Christian experience, no matter what church culture you happen to find yourself within. But here I found Paul talking about edification being the purpose of everything. And that started me on a long journey of studying why this is the case, why there is such a massive difference between biblical terminology of what Christians did in their assemblies and our own modern terminology of what we do in our assemblies. And finally, in 2016, I was getting close to my retirement point, and I still very interested in this topic, had been studying it all along, but I decided I'm going to get involved in a PhD program. I'm going to take the conclusions that I've come to and throw them up against a PhD wall and see what sticks. And I did exactly that. In 2016, I was accepted into the doctoral program at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City. I chose that school because it had excellent professors of New Testament who had gotten their PhD degrees from all over the world, from Oxford and Aberdeen and Edinburgh, and some of the most widely respected doctoral programs in the UK. And they were now teaching there at Midwestern in Kansas City. And I wanted to take advantage of that experience and that knowledge as well. So I started the program in 2016. Then every time I took a different class, I would go into this worship issue and study it from the perspective of whatever that class was, whether the class was on Revelation or John's Gospel or the Synoptic Gospels or whatever it was. I would get into the topic therein. And then finally, when I got to do my PhD dissertation, started in 2019, I chose this topic as the source or as the subject of my doctoral investigation. And 2.5 years later, I had my PhD approved as I went through oral defense and passed that and received my PhD in May of 2022. Now, so one more step to go on here, and that is, I knew that the conclusions I had come to were radically different than almost any church I was familiar with, but I knew I needed to do something with it now. So what I did was I put on a series of lectures in my community at a community center, invited anybody in the community to come and attend, and I had 7 one-hour lectures on this topic, which I then put on YouTube in late 2022. Well, it wasn't until August of 2024 that my video started to get some attraction worldwide. I was first impressed with the fact that, wow, 1,000 people were viewing my videos. 1,000. That was amazing to me. But it exploded in starting in August of 2024. And now, as you noted, Adam, over 750,000 people have seen these videos, and they continue to accelerate every day. I'm getting more than 1,000 views every day. So that's nothing to do with it. I haven't done anything. I just put them on YouTube and they just took off. But there's something going on internationally around the globe, a great deal of dissatisfaction with what's happening in churches, and what I'm saying about worship and edification is touching a nerve. And that's why I'm seeing all these views, I think. So that's my my short answer to your request for a testimony and an epiphany.
Well, and I would give that as homework for anybody that's listening to go listen to. You've done a condensed version of all 7 of those videos into a one hour thing, which is what my dad introduced me to, which is how I first heard about you. And I guess he must have heard about it through, was it you did an interview with Chalcedon, or you had an article with Chalcedon?
Yes, I did. That was all on audio, and that was back in July or something. And I was surprised how much attention that got as well.
So in that sense, I don't want to rehash and recover all the stuff. That I would just direct everybody to go see that stuff there. What has been the primary response that you've received from all of your research and all this finally spreading?
Primary response. Well, I have received over 10,000 comments and emails as a result of this. And the vast majority of those have just come to me in the last 5 months. And every day I'm getting swamped with comments and emails, usually 20 to 60 per day. So when you ask about the general response, I think it's, I'm running into a lot of people around the globe. And speaking of the globe, these people who are viewing my videos are coming from over 110 countries. Primarily America, yes, but all over the place. But I'm getting responses from people who have been saying things like, I stopped going to church 10 years ago, and my spiritual life has never been better as a result of it. People are finding what we have been doing in church to be non-productive. Uh, it's not producing disciples. It's not producing more spiritual people. It's not producing people who are advancing in their skills and developing in their skills as Christian teachers, Christian leaders, elders, Christian examples in their community. Our model that we have developed, it's not in the New Testament, but we have developed this, is coming to a point where more and more people are realizing it's not working. And to connect this with my dissertation, edification is the key issue. That was Paul's key issue in the first century. The making sure that whatever you do in your assembly, make sure that other people are being built up and are growing and are becoming stronger Christians as a result of it. But I don't think that's happening with our model of having church buildings and having one guy get up and be the preacher dude who hammers away for 40 minutes on some sort of thing, or maybe also having a worship team that goes on for 30 minutes with some sort of concert situation. Yeah, I know we've been fascinated with this whole thing. And yes, there are positive things about that whole thing, about the preacher dude and the worship stuff, but it's not cutting it. It's not growing people. It's not developing disciples and edifying people. Edifying one another is a key issue in the Bible. This one anothering that should be taking place in the assembly of people participating in these gatherings and speaking to one another, to teach one another, to comfort one another, to encourage one another. We just have one person doing that for everybody, and everybody just sits there and nothing happens, frankly.
I've noticed that as well with just the discipleship model. I mean, that's built into the family. Fathers have children that they raise up. But then all of a sudden, when it comes to spiritual discipleship, either fathers sort of have gotten the idea that they're not qualified, the pastor needs to do that. I liken it to if somebody's learning how to become a doctor, at a certain level, there's a doctor that you have to tail. And he's going to ask you, what would you do in this situation? Not just, well, I'll give you your education by working on you and treating you, but then I'm not actually going to take you with me to go treat anybody else.
Very good. You're talking about the Jesus model. You have one guy, a rabbi, a teacher, who has a small group of disciples who they walk and talk together. They ask questions. It's amazing how many times throughout the Gospels Jesus' most fundamental teaching comes as a result of a question that somebody asks, that somebody felt free to ask. And Jesus gives usually a very short answer to it. And thus, this dialogue takes place where people grow, people are edified, people learn, they develop. But that's not happening with this preacher model, this pulpit model, this church building model that we have developed. Now, I'm not calling for the end of all those things, but what I'm calling for, at the very least, is we need to break big groups into small groups. It's in the small group atmosphere where people feel free to talk back, to ask questions, to object, to disagree, and get something going there where people are learning through the process. Yes, it all needs to be done decently and in order, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14:40. And it all needs to be done with love for one another, as he emphasizes in 1 Corinthians 13, as well as in chapter 16, verse 14. That all that needs to take place in that kind of atmosphere, but it can only take place in small groups, which in the first century, how did they meet then? Did they have church buildings? No. They met in homes. They met in homes. Not that there's something sacrosanct about a home, and if you meet any place else, you're going to go to hell. That's not the point. But there was something beneficial about this home atmosphere where people felt free to talk to one another, to relate to one another, to be real people with real problems and asking real questions that in that environment of just 20 people or whatever it is, people can grow. And that's how the gospel exploded in the first several centuries. It's through these house meetings that just kept multiplying and multiplying wherever they went. But we're not there anymore, are we?
And I think you see that the home is an untapped resource, even with the explosion of Airbnb. You've got all of these spaces that people are perfectly able to meet and make available as long as it makes money, and Airbnb figured out how to do that. But then when it comes to this glaring problem of we need spaces for small groups to make disciples, we act like, well, we just need to go build more church buildings to do that.
Yep. Good point. That's been the mindset. I mean, that was my mindset. I mean, that's what that I learned under. That's what I was trained under through however many years of seminary that I've had. How many years is it? 9 years of seminary, plus 4 years of college. That's been the model that's been in our heads, but that was not the model in the first century. We need to rethink what we're doing. I'm not calling for the destruction of everything, but we need to start looking at the purpose of what we do when we get together and make sure it's accomplishing the purpose for which it was established, which, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 14:26, when he said, when you come together, let all things be done for building up of one another, oikodome, edification. That's what Paul said. And he's talking specifically about when you come together. But I think we're missing it.
There's something to be said about knowing a little bit of Greek. I know some people might recoil and say, you're saying we can't understand this unless we go back into the Greek. Well, that's very limiting, because how many people know Greek well enough to reason through the scriptures thinking in Greek terms? Where do we get the idea of this needs to be done for worship, and this is a holy thing that we offer to God as an acceptable sacrifice, just like they used to do in the temple?
Yeah. Let me back up a little bit. Let me respond to the Greek thing. You don't actually need to know any Greek to figure out this edification stuff. It's right there in any translation of the Bible you want to use. It's all right there. Just come to the text with an open mind, and you'll figure it out. You don't need to know Greek. You don't need to know Hebrew or Latin or anything. But it does help to figure out why things are the way they are. And that goes to your second question there was, how did we develop this system where we think that when we gather together, it should be for the worship of God, that we come together to offer up God something? Well, this was the mindset of Jews and pagans when they went to a temple. In the temple, they did primarily two things that they were there for. One was to come to prostrate, perform proskuneo, which is the primary Greek word that is usually translated as worship. But my doctoral research into this word, studying all 265 times it's found in the Old and the New Testament, in the Septuagint and the New Testament Greek, it doesn't mean worship. It means to prostrate yourself. So that was the main reason why somebody went to the temple, because that's where their God was, and you had to present yourself to God. Read Deuteronomy 16:16. It was commanded of every male Jew that they go to the temple 3 times a year, present themselves to God. And there's only one way to present yourself to God, and that was in prostration. And this was also done by pagans. When they would go to a pagan temple, they would prostrate when they came in to the holy place, to the place where the God resided. What do you do before a God? Well, you bow down. You get your face on the ground. And then the second thing you do, whether it's a Jewish temple or a pagan one, you offer sacrifice. And that's also mentioned right there in Deuteronomy 16:16. You're not to come empty-handed, God says, to the Jews when they came to the temple back in ancient Judaism. So there's two things: prostration and sacrifice was the reasons why they came there. But we have essentially rebuilt this temple system. It was gone in the first century. Jesus predicted the end of the temple in Mark 13, in Matthew 24, in Luke 17 and 21, predicted it's going to be completely destroyed. And it was. Jesus was dead on accurate there. In AD 70, it was destroyed. And the temple now, in the Christian era, or what Jesus says, the temple now is our bodies. God no longer dwells in a building in Jerusalem or any place else. He now dwells within the hearts of Christians through the Holy Spirit. That's the temple of the Holy Spirit, right? We know this. Paul teaches this in 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 6, 2 Corinthians 8. It's there. We know this, but yet we still think that God's in that house of God on the street corner, and we go there to do things for him. But this was not a mindset that Christians had in the first, second, or third century. It wasn't till they started building magnificent cathedrals in the Constantinian era in the fourth century that kind of a concept was rebuilt again. So I think that's a brief answer to your question, but I've got an entire full hour lecture on this. It's video number 6 in my series that I encourage people to take a look at, because that study was really eye-opening to me as I began to trace how and why this worship idea developed after the New Testament era. We know for sure it wasn't there in the first century, but then we start to see little breadcrumbs of how it begins to develop in the second and in the third, and then finally it's in full bore in the fourth century.
One of the things you mentioned was that the word abad or oved, which means to work in Hebrew, depending on the context in the Septuagint, is translated as latreo or a different Greek word, which I found really interesting, that that Hebrew word sort of mixes or conflates two possible aspects of it, and you have to know on the context which way it's being used. Because I think that word is used when God puts Adam in the garden and says, work the ground. And then that same word is also used when Moses requests to Pharaoh, our God wants us to go into the wilderness to let us go that we may serve him. That same word oved is used there. What's the other word instead of latreo that's used in Greek to translate that Hebrew word?
I'm thinking here, there's actually a couple or three different words that are translated into Greek from abad, which means to serve or to work. But the key issue here, before we get too deep into the Hebrew and Greek, I can already see some of the folks watching scratching their heads. It's all Greek to me, they're saying, and now we're getting to Hebrew? Oh my. Well, here's the thing. When Jews went to the temple, they did this abad, that's the Hebrew word, which got to be translated when it's used in this context of when you go to the temple or when you appear before your God, translated with this Greek word latreia or latruo. And latruo in this context means to serve with sacrifice. That kind of service it's being offered. It's not just generic service. It really shouldn't be translated with the regular word serve, because that doesn't get it. But it's to serve deity with sacrifice when that appears. I could go on for a couple days on that topic, but I'm wondering if that's enough there, Adam. You feel free to ask more on that.
Sure. And I asked that because it seems that in the New Covenant, our worship of God is seen as, in the temple, there was a particular aspect of temple worship, which was seen as special because there was an extra danger, right? If you offer a sacrifice that's not acceptable, there are consequences. We see people getting burned up, things like that, for offering strange fire. Mm-hmm. I think of it now as the promises of what has been holy is now expanded. So now that the work that we do, your average believer is a priest now and is doing priestly work just in his normal everyday doing good deeds. Hebrews 13, I believe 19?
Probably 15 and 16.
Yeah, Hebrews 13:16 talks about us doing good deeds is considered a sacrifice.
Yes. Really, what's happening there in Hebrews 12 and 13 is it's almost the equivalent of what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. Uh, Hebrews 12:28 uses this Greek word latreia that we just referred to. Sometimes it's translated as worship, but it just confuses the English reader when it does that. It's talking about serving deity with sacrifice. Christians, of course, do not sacrifice. Jesus was our sacrifice, our once for all sacrifice for sin. The idea that we need to continually offer sacrifices is a slap in the face of Jesus, who gave his life so that this once for all sacrifice would be taken care of, that no more sacrifices for sins are necessary, as the writer of Hebrews describes extensively in chapter 7, 8, 9, 10 there. But in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, Paul says, for us, because of the mercies of God, we are to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is our spiritual latreia. Now, I know the translation is sometimes worship, but that throws off the English reader. It's our spiritual latreia. It's the way we now offer sacrifices. We don't offer sacrifices anymore for sin because Jesus did that. But our sacrifice now is to offer our body as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. And that kind of sacrifice sees itself in Hebrews 13:16 in doing good and sharing with other people. This is our life of a sacrifice now in the as Christians in the New Testament era.
And would you agree it's better than what they had in the Old Covenant? Now, in that sense, our sacrifices are better and more edifying, I suppose you could say, than killing a cow would be in terms of pleasing God or serving God. Now God, how does David put it? The sacrifice of a broken spirit and a contrite heart.
Yeah, it is better. And the writer of Hebrews uses the word better, I believe, a number of times because he's God didn't send his son because things were just fine the way they were. He wanted things to be better. And by Jesus' sacrifice, things do inherently get better. We get better. But then now to tie it up to with our earlier discussion, we're not getting better if we're just sitting there and listening to sermons every week. In order for us to get better, we need to be edifying and building up one another in our assemblies, asking questions, interacting with one another, questioning one another, encouraging one another, praying for one another, forgiving one another, all these kinds of things in this one anothering atmosphere that takes place in our assemblies. And it's something that I'm afraid is just not happening in the vast majority of churches on the planet.
I think it's really important that you establish a certain level of trust with the people that you're engaging with that in. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, if you have two Jews in a room, you have three opinions. There's something there. There's something there that a certain form of brotherhood. What's the passage that says a brother is born for adversity? There's a certain level of security that I feel with my brother that we could really go head to head, toe to toe on a certain topic because we have a very, very deep bond. We're not at risk of breaking that over seriously disagreeing on something. And I think that level of trust has to be established. That's not necessarily present in a public church service where anybody can come, believers or unbelievers, and you don't know who's there, especially if it's 500 or 1,000 people.
Yeah. It's when we disagree, and I suggest that we, at any given moment, anybody in the church disagrees with anybody else on something. It just happens. But Christians should be advancing in their own Christian maturity. so that they can disagree agreeably, that they can correct one another with kindness and with love and respect, and still maintain that bond that they have through the Holy Spirit, so that they keep the peace among themselves. But you've got to, unless you have this free atmosphere where people can ask questions and speak up, people aren't going to grow. There was ran across a statement probably 40 years ago. A writer, a Christian leader named Alexander Campbell, back in the 1850s, made the statement, freedom of discussion is the heart and soul of all reformation. I believe that's right. You've got to have an atmosphere where people feel free to discuss, to exchange ideas, to disagree, and to challenge one another. And in that atmosphere, growth takes place, reformation takes place, and we all start to get better. And now I know that that process can be a little messy at times, but it's in the crucible of the assembly where there are these exchanges, where we all start to emerge stronger, more spiritual, more mature people. But in the way our churches are set up right now, I don't think it's happening.
What's the proverb? Where the stall is empty, the manger is clean. There's a certain level of honesty in there being a little bit of a mess, because it shows that work's being done. Even looking back to the temple sacrifices, work is being done. That means that there's mess, there's blood in different places, things like that. Some of the best times that I can think of, and it wasn't necessarily when I was being most edified, but it was when I had opportunity to edify other people, or at least be in the presence of somebody who was deeply edified, was very comforting and inspiring to me. When we would do Sunday night small groups, there was a couple of missionary families from China that we would meet with, and they told us they looked forward to it more than going to church. And there was a freedom there to ask questions. There would be some kind of brief lesson on the Trinity or something like that. And then afterwards, we would talk about political things. It might be gun control. It could be child rearing. It could be dating. All kinds of different things. But they were very, very particular. You knew exactly who you were talking to, who was asking, because you were in a home environment. You knew through other conversations, just casually, what this person was going through, what their background was in. And so you knew how to caveat things. It was incredibly healthy. And it took a little bit of skill in sort of orchestrating it. There's some skill in being hospitable, but that's one of the requirements for being an elder. So that should be a given that ability is there.
Excellent point. Yep. Unless people are given the opportunity to develop those skills, they're not going to develop those skills of dealing with disagreements, with other points of view, with exchanging ideas. But we don't have that skill. Our model does not allow it to happen. I want to make sure people don't think that I'm wanting us to tear down our church buildings. But what I do want us to do, somehow, somewhere, break into small groups, because that's where it happens. That's where, like those missionaries you mentioned, felt free to talk to one another. This is where growth takes place. And I'm getting comments from every continent, people saying, yes, it's in these small groups, whether it's in a home or some other venue, it's in the small groups where people are growing. They're building relationships with one another. Their faith is deepening. They're becoming disciples, real disciples of Jesus. But in the big church, sitting in the pew, listening to the pulpit, not happening.
So I brought this up to a pastor at one point, and he brought up a passage, Hebrews 12:18 through 29, which basically describes, it seems to me to sort of be waxing poetic about the analogy of God's appearance on Sinai, and using that to reference today and activities in the church today. How would you respond to that particular passage? It might be helpful if I read it, or if you're familiar with it, if you've answered this before, you could just launch right into it too.
Yeah, no, and maybe for the people who are listening who may not know what we're talking about here, we should in Hebrews 12, verse 28. Why don't you read that one? I don't have that in front of me, but I have a memory of it.
Verse 28 is, "Therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire."
Yeah. Now that says acceptable worship. Now, that's the Greek word latreia. Now, when English-speaking people see that word worship, we immediately think, that's what we do in our assemblies. However, that word is never used in the New Testament to refer to what Christians do in their assemblies. It again, as I mentioned earlier, latreia refers to serving deity with sacrifice. But what he's saying there, the way now we serve God with sacrifices, is what he starts to outline in chapter 13 by being hospitable, by letting the marriage bed be undefiled, as he'll say in verse 4, by doing good and sharing, verse 16, as you pointed out earlier. This is our latreia now. That's what's happening in Hebrews chapter 12. And this all happens in front of the great cloud of witnesses that he mentions at the beginning of chapter 12. So we have come to Mount Zion, not in church, but we Christians have come to this situation where we're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, all these great heroes of the faith throughout all the Old Testament who are watching what we're doing now, experiencing this new era where there is no temple, where there are no more sacrifices being offered, but where our new sacrifices are changed lives of doing good and sharing and being hospitable and living holy and righteous lives. That's what I think is going on in Hebrews 12 and 13 there.
Do you feel like time spent listening to sermons can eventually, once you've reached a certain level of maturity, it tends to sap believers of their energy to be hospitable? Because they don't have enough time in the meeting to respond to something that, for me, that can get exhausting. Listening to something that I'm already familiar with, that I've heard before, and I'm not allowed to respond to it in any way. Do you think that people sort of take the attitude of, all the need for that is done, I don't need to, that, like, I did my penance, and now I can go and continue on with my life?
Yeah, I fear that most people, a ton of people, when they go to church, they're wanting to check the box. They know they're supposed to do this. This is a part of being a Christian. We got to go to church. And so they go through the motions and they listen to the sermon, got to check that box, and they got to sing that song, check that box. But who's getting better? Who's being edified? Who's being built up? And what are you doing as a regular Christian to help to affect the growth and maturity of other Christians? It's just not happening. Well, I had to smile when you said, Adam, when you sit there and listen to a sermon, I got to admit, I've been listening to sermons I'm 72 years old, so you get the idea. I already know by looking at the title of the sermon and by looking at the passage, I know where this is going. And yes, it saps the strength right out of me to sit there and endure the whole thing. I'm just being honest, folks, just being honest. And I was once that preacher dude up there in the pulpit. And I want to be compassionate to the ministers who are going through the process of preparing that sermon and delivering that sermon and trying to keep everybody's attention. But the model isn't working, people. The model of the New Testament does work. Jesus' model of having a group of disciples, a small group where you ask questions of one another and start to learn in that environment. That's where people get better. That's where people also they get excited about being in that kind of environment. And part of the excitement there comes from the fact that somebody somewhere respects me as a human being enough that they will listen to the stupid questions I've got. I really mean that this is a key deal here of just simple respect of human beings. Because I think that the way we got so upset, I disconnected my headset here. Hang on here.
Technical difficulties.
Respecting human beings, just respecting the knowledge that they have, the insights that they have, the Spirit of God that dwells in them, and not just in one guy who's hiding behind a pulpit. If we have that kind of respect for one another, then we can start to learn from one another. But not until we let each other speak.
There's a certain bite that's lost, I think, in sermons too, especially when you're addressing a very large crowd. And you know it has to be somewhat relevant to everyone, rather than being incredibly relevant to one person, but might completely miss somebody else. And so in that sense, by trying to make something for everybody, you're making something for no one.
It's very, very, very true. I'm afraid that that's just a simple fact that all the homiletics classes have missed. And I've been through several of those homiletics classes.
Another thing that I've noticed in myself too is that it's like, for some people, the desire to go out and help the poor is satiated by, there's a food stamp program for that. There's welfare. That's not my responsibility. I pay somebody to do that for me. I think, and I noticed this mentality developing in myself before I started to think this way. The pastor's there. He's doing the evangelism stuff for me. He's going out there and making sure the word is getting out. And there's so many people. He's able to address so many people and in one go. That's a very efficient way to go about doing things. Why should I get involved? He's better at it than I am. So go somewhere else where I'm needed.
Yeah, I think this is one of the unintended consequences of the church model that we have today. A lot of people are just looking at the pastor and saying, boy, I'm glad I'm paying that guy to do it because I sure don't want to do it, or I don't even get the chance to do it. So it just we end up creating a congregation of consumers, people who are sitting there and just absorbing whatever it is you throw at me, and I'll take it, even if I disagree with it. Nobody's growing, and people are bailing out of churches. If you've seen I have another presentation that I launched a few weeks ago that's already received like 45,000 views of church attendance statistics here in my own hometown over the last 40 years. Church attendance has dropped 60% over the last 40 years, and I dare say that's true in virtually any community in America, in North America, and probably most of the planet as well. 60% drop over the last 40 years, and it's continuing to tank like this. All the excitement that we got many years ago about all this new, the bringing in the worship bands and the guitars and the drums, we thought, oh man, this is great. We can rock them out, and boy, people start to come in from miles around. Well, they're over that already, and people are sort of tired of listening to this one preacher dude who's up there and who knows what he's doing on the side, because it's too many preacher scandals have destroyed the reputation of pastors around the world. This ought not to be. There's a better way, and it's right there in our Bibles, and we have ignored it.
Somebody asked you a question in another interview. If you had brought all of this stuff up and it had taken off this way back in the late 70s, would it have been received the same way, or were worship services edifying enough that it didn't really matter? And it's only now that we've reached a point where, with technology advent of live streaming, things like that, where you actually can get all of that information in much more efficient ways.
Yes, there's something to the idea that the time is ripe right now for people to listen to what I'm saying. I did say this stuff from the pulpit in 1977. It didn't go over so well. I was summarily called a false teacher and a heretic. And I was scrambling for my livelihood after I preached this stuff. At that time, church attendance was booming in the 70s. Churches tended to be packed back then. Nobody saw anything wrong with the church model as it was at that time. But now people are listening. And I think one of the greatest instigators that made people listen was COVID, when all of a sudden every church on the planet is forced to shut down for a number of months. It has forced a lot of people to rethink, what are we doing in church? Why am I going? I'm sure enjoying not going here for a couple of weeks. Why is that? Maybe I really don't need to go. And even pastors were asking the question, if we're going to be live streaming what we do on Sunday because nobody can be in the sanctuary, if we're going to live stream, what are we going to live stream? What's most important? And what are we doing anyway? And it's asking these fundamental questions that is now making people rethink church. And I think it calls for a rethinking. And start to get back into your New Testament. Take away all your modern presuppositions of what's supposed to be taking place in church and start from a blank slate in your mind and go back in the New Testament and start to rebuild a Christian assembly, what they're doing, why they're doing it, the purpose for which all those things took place, and then we'll get a little different picture about what's supposed to be happening when Christians get together. I think it makes a huge difference of where we end up as human beings at the end of our lives.
It seems too like a lot of the problems that Paul and the other disciples were addressing in all the different epistles were problems you really don't face unless people are living in very close proximity to one another in community.
Well,
that would be they would be symptoms of meeting in house churches, essentially, I would think.
Yes. That's the first thing I thought of as well, house church. These people had relationships. People have asked me, how, if you're going to have a house church, well, how are people going to know where to go to church if they want to start going to church someplace? Well, it's a natural question to ask. But back in the first century, they didn't put out advertisements and about church meeting at Bob's house on Sunday. It's just this small group of committed Christians getting together to build up one another. And it's in that environment where they would slowly bring in a friend, somebody who's inquiring about what's going on there. And then they would see in this gathering in somebody's living room that they really loved one another. They really cared about one another. They're really talking about important issues with one another, about how to grow, how to get better, how to be stronger, how to deal with sin and temptation in our lives and problems in families.
And I've seen
really
them
talking about it.
I've seen them butt heads and disagree, and they want to come back and do it again.
Yeah.
Who are these
It's
people?
got to be done in a loving atmosphere. Paul emphasizes that as well, but need to have the freedom to ask questions and to object and to dispute, but do so in a kind way. And it's in that kind of environment when outsiders see Christians disagreeing, but kindly and in an agreeable manner, then they say, there's something going on here. Maybe these people are onto something.
Iron sharpening iron.
Yeah.
It feels to me, too, like the more we double down on church attendance with having to have a specialized building and preaching sermons to believers, I heard one pastor say, that's the most important thing that you can do in your life, is come and worship God in a church service. I feel like the more that's emphasized, the more impotent Christianity becomes. I'm assuming you feel the same way.
I do. Uh, I once compared going to church like taking your car to a gas station. Now, the purpose of having a car is not to go to a gas station, but you go to the gas station to refill, to be able to continue the car's ministry throughout the week. And in our assemblies, we're there to build up one another. You got to take a pause from life's busy activities and get together in that group with whom you have great relationships and brother and sister relationships in the body of Christ, and there get recharged. The purpose of your life is not to go there to recharge. The purpose is to be recharged so that you can be in ministry and in service to other people through the rest of the week. So I'm with you on that, Adam.
I've come to a lot of similar conclusions, so it's very refreshing to see somebody with so much research behind it come in that sense. There's a little bit of a danger in confirmation bias on my part. I've also looked at this from the aspect of the tithing system and how that worked in the Old Testament. What's changed in the New Covenant is that we're all priests now. Whereas before, you would tithe to the Levites, and priests are a subset of the Levites. But if we're all priests, priests don't tithe to other priests. And so in that sense, I think we're neutering the power that we were told that we have in the New Covenant. As John the Baptist said, the least of these, how does he phrase it? The least, no, I guess it's Jesus that said, John the Baptist was the greatest prophet, but the least believer in the New Covenant will be greater than he.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think we think of ourselves with that level of power as being indwelt by the Holy Spirit, because that was a radical change.
It was huge, and it made Christianity different than anything else on the planet. It became known as the way. It's not a religion. It's a way of life. It's radically different than going to some holy building every week to go through some rituals. But no. It's a way of life. So that when you get together, you're increasing your ability to live and to be productive and to be in service and in ministry to other people. That's a different approach than what most people had at that time, Jews and Gentiles alike.
You mentioned that you don't want to be that guy who's a hindrance to pastors because they're already spread pretty thin. I definitely share that feeling, and I don't see people operating in that way, the traditional church way, as obstacles directly. I do think that the tradition itself, as you mentioned, can be an obstacle to growth. Thinking about it like have you ever seen somebody put a chain around a tree trunk and the tree has grown and there's this very clear, like a corset effect on the tree and it weakens it there. Is that something that is the traditional way of doing things something that can be completely safely left alone? Or does it need to be cut away in some situations at some point? And what might a situation like that look like?
Yeah. In video number 7, the final video of my series of 7 videos, it's titled, "What Do We Do Now?" Which is addressing your question. So what do we do now? But one of the things that I've come up with 9 things that we ought to do now. But the 9 things that I've suggested are things that any church can do without firing anybody and without burning down any buildings. But the key thing that we can do is to break into small groups. Continue to pay your pastor. If you want to still have him preach for 40 minutes every week, If somehow you find that that's useful, go ahead to it and do it. But if you're not breaking into small groups where people can talk back and engage with the topic, engage with what the scriptures are saying that day, yeah, I don't think you're getting anywhere. That's a problem. So that so the main thing I would change is not to fire anybody or to burn down buildings, but is to get into small groups and to let people talk.
It's not so much of something we need to get rid of. It's something that we're missing that we need to add back.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I'll admit there's a whole bunch of people who are responding to my stuff who are calling for uh, the end of the pastor system, who are calling for the end of church buildings. I'm not one of them, but I know where they're coming from. I get it. But I don't see how you can just with one sweep of your hands change all churches everywhere on what they're doing. It comes down to one person. What can you, if you're listening to me right now, what can you do to affect positive change? You don't have to burn down your church building. You don't have to fire your pastor either. But what you can do is start to see the importance of building up one another and start to engage in that process of building up one another.
I've heard different churches either praise expository preaching and denounce topical preaching, and I've heard the opposite, churches preaching encouragement or there's another word I can't think of off the top of my tongue, but also saying that sermons shouldn't be a class. You bring up Romans 12:6-8. Doesn't that kind of say, do whatever edifies? Like there isn't one thing that's always appropriate.
Yeah, I think so. Just a second, Adam. Alexa, stop. Every night at this time, inexplicably, Alexa starts playing music. I can't get it to stop doing it, but that tells me that it's 6 o'clock my time. But to go back to your question about Romans 12 verses 6-8 and the whole issue there, I think, yes, we need to be edifying one another in our gatherings. And what's going on in Romans 12 there, he's saying whatever your gift is, if it's serving, just knock yourself out in serving other people. If it's speaking, knock yourself out in speaking and helping one another. But it's building up one another that should be taking place in our gatherings and with one another, not only in the assembly, but outside the assembly as well. Does that respond to your question?
I believe so. Paul uses the word exhortation, which is the word that I couldn't think of. An exhortation or an encouragement versus teaching. And I think of like a topical sermon as being more of an exhortation, and then an expository sermon being more of a lesson, going bullet point by bullet point. It depends, I would say. It depends on what serves, what's needed, what builds. And it's not you should never do an expository sermon, or you should always do an expository sermon. I think that's a bit narrow-minded, it sounds like.
I agree with that. I've also been through the school of thought that says expository preaching is the only way to go. I've been through those homiletics classes, but the whole homiletics classes are built upon a presupposition that what is supposed to happen in church gatherings is you get somebody who stands up and starts a monologue, an oration of some kind that needs to go on for a minimum of 25 minutes or whatever it is in your particular church culture. Stop that. No, don't do that. Let's build up one another. Let's respect one another enough. Let's let other people talk and ask questions. And it's in that environment where people grow. But homiletics classes are built upon the false idea that what we're supposed to do when we get together is have one guy get up and talk for a whole long period of time. People don't have attention spans anymore like that. The TikTok and YouTube Shorts, where you have these little 15-second or 60-second little shots. That's about people have an attention span that lasts that long. But to sit in a pew and listen to somebody for 30 minutes, a talking head who with very little visual aids go along with it. Oh man, I can't do it anymore. I don't know about you. It's just not getting it.
I think a lot of contemporary churches have realized that, and they'll have these sort of pulsating, undulating light displays behind because they know people need that stimulation.
Yes, well, good luck with that too. But what's really stimulating is when you let me talk and when I let you talk, and then we engage with one another. Again, this requires a smaller group. Go ahead and have your big group with a lot of people with one person talk. But if you're not breaking into smaller groups after that, at some point during the week and letting people engage with the topic and talk back, I don't think people are going to learn or grow.
And big groups can be fun, I think, in limited quantities. You think of the Old Testament gatherings when they would come 3 times a year. It would be the entire nation, and there would be a big festival. But that wasn't every single week. That was 3 times a year, special occasions.
Excellent point. And that tends to be forgotten. People assume that what we do in church now is just what they did in the temple back then every week, but they didn't do that in the temple every week. It's only 3 times a year they'd have these big feasts, and even then they're feasting. They're killing cows and feeding off of the great feast that would take place as a result of all these sacrifices. It wouldn't be lots of preaching. There'd be a little bit. There'd be some singing, but this is just 3 times a year. But one of the questions I had in my dissertation, at the end of every dissertation, one thing everybody's supposed to do is come up with a suggestion for future study to advance, to take the football down the field a little bit further that you couldn't do in that particular dissertation. And one of the questions that I had that people need to investigate is what exactly did Jews do congregationally in the temple on a regular basis? We have presumed a whole lot of stuff that just ain't true. Therein, go study your Bibles, figure it out. But even if you figure out what they were doing in the temple is gone, folks. Jesus predicted it would be gone. Its purpose is gone. And there's no comparing that system with a house church situation. They're 2 completely different institutions, 2 completely different purposes involved with what's going on there, and even different activities taking place in those 2 different things. So let's not even get involved in comparing the 2 things. Let's just get involved with building up one another, which is Paul's specific direct command in 1 Corinthians 14:26.
I even read one book, somebody was trying to calculate how long should the songs be based off of the proportion of additional Levites that David added when the Ark of the Covenant was brought in to Jerusalem finally in his lifetime. How many new people did he hire, and what was the proportion? So that needs to be your proportion of sermon length to song. It wasn't a really page-turning book to begin with. But then I just want to say, in terms of what they would do on the Sabbath, if you want to just use that as a model, it was a holy convocation. But even there, in I believe it's in Leviticus, it says, in all your dwelling places, a holy convocation to the Lord. So it didn't involve the temple.
The Jews celebrating Shabbat in homes is the Sabbath gathering was a common thing. But even still, again, let's just not confuse what was taking place in ancient Hebrew culture with what should be going on in Christian gatherings, enlightened by what we read in our New Testaments.
With home congregations, do you think that there's a danger of assemblies going off the rails into the negative side of excessive spiritual discussion, maybe wives' tales, endless genealogies that Paul warns against, sloppy, dangerous doctrine. How do congregations guard against that, especially now that they're not being sort of supervised and sedated, if you prefer that term, in a sermon setting?
I like the sedated idea. Yes, it's almost as if everybody's been given drugs before they go into church, and so that they're calm and they're cooperative, and until they get out, and then they can say whatever they want. Well, so yeah, I mean, we're not being productive. Uh, I'm trying to remember what your initial question was there, before you started talking about sedating people.
The danger of sort of, I guess, unsupervised discussion where people are going to get things wrong and then maybe start doubling down on doctrine that's not heavily supervised anymore, which is part of the goal. How do you guard against going off the rails and delving into wives' tales and endless genealogies?
Well, it was a problem in the first century. Paul mentions it in 1 Corinthians 14. He mentions it in the pastoral epistles as well, a number of times, people going off into disputes about words, he'll say. It's a problem, but with wise, spiritual, mature leadership, those things get quickly corrected and gently corrected, and the discussion gets pointed into a productive vein if you have a good, wise, compassionate, mature leader. And that's what we should be developing all along, is developing wise, compassionate, mature leaders. Can't we do this? Can't we find anybody in a church of 300 who can do that? What's wrong with us if we haven't been able to develop anybody doing that? Sorry, I just raised my voice. But you understand why, right? We're just failing. We're failing miserably, and nobody's winning.
Well, it's sort of like complaining that the reason you can't do this is because you haven't been doing it, essentially. The reason you can't meet in house churches is because you're not mature enough because you haven't been meeting in house churches.
Yeah, this circular reasoning just doesn't go anywhere. Well, yeah. I've had the good fortune. I'm not a house churcher. People might presume that I'm a house church person who's been pushing that case and banging that drum, but I'm not. I am somebody who's been involved in small group meetings for almost every week for the last 50 years, and I can testify that that's where I grow. I don't grow much of anything by sitting in a church service. There it is. I'm honest. There it is. I just said it for the world to know. I don't get anything out of a church service anymore. I'll cooperate. I'll go along. I'll participate in the whole thing and be nice and not disruptive. But it's in the small group where I grow, where other people grow, and that's where we need to encourage people to speak up.
I would say that, growing up, house meetings sort of had a bad reputation. People that stopped going to church and replaced it with house meetings, they tended to have a bad reputation for being places that sort of harbor a blanket resentment against all church authority. I don't want to discount specific situations where that might be warranted behavior. But is there a way to take a hold of what you're saying in a way that emphasizes home gatherings are to be done in pursuit of how to be in better submission to God's authority and being a joy to be governed rather than being stubborn and pugnacious?
Yeah. I have not seen this problem of sort of this rebellious, anti-authoritarian approach in house gatherings, but I can see how it can develop. So I hear you there. But again, wise, mature, compassionate leadership can nip that stuff in the bud quickly. There's plenty of times right in the scriptures where Paul says to obey your leaders, submit to your elders. Um, everybody's got to be subject to somebody. And so listen to the wise leaders among you. And we don't need to be this anti-authoritarian stuff. Just we can learn from one another and respect one another. They Our meetings don't have to be chaos. That's what Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians 14. If you really are trying to build up one another in what you say, then the meetings become positive events. They're all growth oriented, positive oriented, not negative oriented, not critical and condemning, but building up. Edifying is the opposite of cutting down. And we need to be building up one another.
I guess this last one isn't a question, but I'll wrap up with this. There was a church in my area that recently had a meeting to discuss the Christian demographics in our city that estimates in 40 years there's going to be 20,000 believers attending the denomination's worship services every week. They realize that there's a need to grow their leadership base because there's only 5 or 6 pastors and less than 25 elders overseeing about 2,500 members currently. When I asked if I could be trained and discipled to assist someday, they said, unfortunately not, because I don't have a college degree of any kind. Yet I recently had one of their pastoral training program graduates tell me that I've been better trained already than some of them. Now, I don't see that as an obstacle to carrying out the work that I'm already doing, but it does make me a little sad that leadership doesn't see a direct use for me. After I spent my entire life sitting under the church's care and my father's instruction, who is an elder, that this somehow isn't enough to make me useful. How would you respond to situations like this being repeatedly played out by the thousands, maybe millions across the world?
Well, I have to bite my tongue first because it would make me really angry. I believe in education. Obviously, I've spent a ton of my life in school and going through seminary and all that, and I got all these degrees. But the idea that you got to have a college degree in order to be a Christian leader is baloney. I know plenty of people who have PhDs who are jerks, who have no business being in church leadership. There's nothing about going to school that's going to make you a more mature individual. None of the disciples of Jesus went off to school, but they had the opportunity to ask questions and to walk with the master. And if we allow people to ask questions and to walk with the teachers among us, there's no reason why a large percentage of our people can be growing to become leaders themselves. The arrogance and just thinking somebody's got to have a degree to in order to be a leader. It's just I don't know, Adam. I don't have a lot of sympathy for that line of thought. I understand where they're coming from. I get it. I mean, I believe in education too, but yeah, there's not a soul in the New Testament who needed to have that kind of education in order to be a leader in the church. We're just emphasizing the wrong things. Paul said, 1 Corinthians 8:1, he says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If we were training our people on how to love, how to be caring and compassionate, then I think we'd be getting somewhere. But if we're just pumping people full of information so that they get more and more knowledgeable, they're just getting puffed up. They're getting arrogant. And that doesn't really present much of a use to anybody else. So I guess that's what I'd say, Adam. And I think I've been probably way too direct. I need to take my medication and calm down.
Yeah, it is something I do in that way feel like there's a large portion of the body that's been told you're not able to serve the rest of the body. In some ways, maybe I feel like an intestine, which is told, its purpose is to be on the inside, and if you're seen, then something's wrong. You shouldn't be able to see somebody's intestines. That means that there's an injury going on. And in some way, I'm happy to be that. I'm happy to help in ways that are unseen. But I'm sure there are a lot of people that feel that same way.
Yep. I don't doubt that there are. Here's a comparable situation that somebody presented to me once. They said they kind of opposed the idea of a house church or of small group gatherings because it would become, and here's the key words, a pooling of ignorance. So you've got to have the pastor be there and to make sure that it's not a pooling of ignorance. Well, but think this through now. We've been sitting with hundreds of people in our pews week after week, month after month, year after year, and that still, with those people being a pooling of ignorance, all we've done is create a whole bunch of ignorant people who went to church for 50 years, and it's just a pooling of ignorance to let them talk. That's an indictment of what our system is doing. If we're not making any more progress than just creating a bunch of ignorant people, then shut down the doors. You're not making any progress at all. Something's got to change. It's crazy.
There's got to be a better way to end than that. Give me some encouragement at the end, some kind of exhortation.
Well, okay, let's do it this way. What I'd really like to think is that, let's say somebody becomes a Christian today, that if every week when they went to a Christian gathering, and let's suppose it's a small group, and let's suppose they're being encouraged to speak. Let's suppose everybody knows that the purpose of them being there is to build up one another. That new Christian today, a year from now, having gone through 50-some gatherings where the purpose of every meeting was to build up one another, to make sure we're better, stronger, more compassionate, more understanding, more forgiving, and even increasing in our ability to teach and to correct one another, to admonish one another, increasing our ability to do that after a year, after 10 years, after 30 years. Think of the kind of people we would be creating. Think of the difference that those people would be making in their families, in their homes, in their jobs, when they're in the community, participating in Kiwanis Club or whatever it is, that people start to realize, hey, these Christians have got something. They're different people. And they're not a bunch of arrogant jerks like they used to be when all they were involved in is politics. Oh, don't let me get off on that tangent. But the positive thing here is, Adam, that there's a lot of progress we could be making. The sky is the limit. We just need to get back to doing things in a sort of this biblical way with a biblical purpose of building up one another.
You're giving wonderful mother hen vibes in terms of the church being a strong bride to raise up children for God. And that's not something that I hear from churches typically. It's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, the church should be an incubator where people have the ability to grow under the warm light of this incubator situation where people love one another. They understand that we have weaknesses. They understand that we have faults, that some of us are less patient than other people are. But it's in that warmth and loving, caring, mothering atmosphere that we grow.
Dr. Wadsworth, thank you so much for your time. I pray God continues to bless this and more people hear it.
Thank you, Adam. This was a good discussion. Thank you.